wind was in the north, the salt got down to Owego. After a while, got down to Ithaca and was offloaded on wagons and pulled up the hill. Probably a wagon would have 4 tons on it or so, in barrels this would have been. And pulled up the hill and put on the end of the excuse me, getting ahead of myself. Went on the Ithaca to Owego Turnpike to Owego, where it was loaded onto arks and rafts in the Susquehanna River and floated down to Baltimore or some other place and sold. And it was a very lucrative business, very profitable. Well, about 1824, I think it was, the Erie Canal was completed, such a matter, and then it was a big deal for canals to be built. And over in the next lake over, Seneca, the fellows got together over there and they were going to build a canal, or put in to build a canal, and they did eventually, from Watkins Glen down to Elmira to the Chemung River, which fed, of course, into the Susquehanna and went to the same place. Well, the Ithaca boys and the Owego boys were pretty scared that they were going to lose that business, that lucrative salt business. So they looked around and, well, we could probably build a canal, connect the two, but they didn't have the foggiest notion what the territory was like. So they hired somebody to look it over, and, well, no, you really can't do that because it's 600 feet almost straight up out of Ithaca. And if you go up the 6 Mile Gorge or 6 Mile Creek Valley, yes, you could get up there with a series of locks, but when you got to the height of the land, it's dry as a bone. There's no water up there. That would be somewhere up, oh, probably along the Coddington Road or near the Coddington Road, probably about 4 miles from Ithaca, coming this way. So that was shot in the head. And then they decided, well, there were some small railroads had been built. And there was one in Connecticut, I believe it was, 3 miles long, took granite from a quarry down to the Neponset River and loaded it on to be taken for other places. So, and then there was another one near Boston. And so I think it was Pompelli, one of the Pompellis from Owego, went to see it, and oh, it was wonderful. And then the boys in Ithaca, they got to talking it up, and yes, why, this was marvelous. All these old wagons that we'd had to hitch 8 horses and mules to and drag down over the dirt road of the turnpike and slop through the mud and so on and so forth. This set up on rails, and why, it was just like sliced bread. A couple of horses could pull 10 times the weight that 8 horses could, and on and on. Well, okay. So they got together, guys from Owego and guys from Ithaca got together, and they put in for a charter, which they got in 1828, for 50 years, and then they tried to raise some money, or did raise some money, and it took a while, and finally they got around to surveying and starting the construction, but there was this big problem. I'm getting ahead of myself. There were two routes surveyed. Corps of Engineers engineer, Swift, I think his name was, surveyed a route, the route that was followed eventually, up South Hill, out of Ithaca, and up to the height of land there, and then it went up gradually following the contour for a ways, and then from where I mentioned about 4 miles from Ithaca, maybe 5, it was all downhill in quotes to Owego. The other route that was surveyed was out of the inlet, up the inlet valley, up into the height of land between Tioga and Tompkins County, which, if some of you are familiar with it, it occurs just above North Spencer ways. You go under the underpass there, under the old railroad, and it's up there about a mile. There used to be a spring that came out of a pipe that came out into the road ditch, and my dad pointed it out way years ago. It was right on the watershed, and in freshet time in the spring, of course the pipe ran most of the time anyway, but right there was the watershed, and the water that went to the north went into the St. Lawrence River, and the water that went to the south went into the Susquehanna and down the Chesapeake Bay, which is kind of neat for a kid to sit there and look at that. Well, anyways, that height of land was about 600 feet, and a little bit higher more than the one at Ithaca, but it had to go through some pretty rough terrain. And when you get a chance to look at the topographical map and see that route, you will understand, because, and if you've driven it, of course, well, most of you have, you get into some pretty hairy country there with glacial kettles and every which way, mounds and gullies, and I can imagine it would have been a nightmare to go through there with the primitive things that they had to work with in those days to build a railroad. But now we still got to figure out what we're going to do. So they decided to take the one South Hill, and there was a bright young fellow that said, well, we can build an inclined plane that will take, in fact, we can build 2 of them. We can go up part way up the hill, and about 510 feet or so, and then there's a levelish sort of place, and then we can go on up another, in a more gradual plane up to near the end of the track, or at the end of the track. So they did that after much expense and huge amounts of lumber, which of course was rather cheap in those days. And so they, after they got this contraption built, it was supposedly, the idea was that you could lower a couple of loaded cars that had come up from Owego with lumber, or mostly lumber in those days, while at the same time you were drawing up a couple of cars loaded with salt or plaster, which was another big commodity that they exported through Ithaca down to Owego in the river to be taken on down where the big cities were under construction everybody needed plastered walls and all that stuff. Plus, some of it was used for fertilizer, I guess. And all this had been taking place on the Ithaca Owego Turnpike in fine style, and it happened that during the War of 1812, the plaster was shut off from Nova Scotia, so all the trade that went down through there was sort of unusual. Well, of course, that didn't mean too much to them, or at least they didn't think it did. But they got a rude awakening when the war was over and the plaster resumed, the trade resumed with Nova Scotia and so on. And then this traffic on the turnpike went down very drastically. And by the time the railroad was built, most of the plaster that was hauled on it was coming out of central New York. And so gypsum and limestone both. And so the inclined planes were sort of well, really they were impractical and a blockage in the railroad, the efficiency of the railroad, because they could only haul up, they said about, various sources said about 5 pairs of cars a day, loaded cars. That, 25 cars a day. Okay, well, I did a little ciphering, and 25 cars, I figured they held about 4 tons, because I ran across another reference that said 30 tons, 8 cars, I think it was, represented about 30 tons of stuff. So I gave the value of, they were short cars, small short cars, I don't know, they probably weren't too much longer than this, yeah, probably about 10, 12 feet long, I guess. Anyways, about 4 tons to the car, so that, I can't remember exactly my numbers, but it figured out about an average of about, let's see, 25 would be 100 tons. And this was on a good day. 100 tons would be about, see, 4 tons to a wagon would be about 25 wagons. That's right. I had it about the same number of wagons would had to been loaded to go out of Ithaca on the turnpike to match the number of wagons or the equivalent that went up the inclined planes in the day's time. Well, at one point they said there was 800 teams a day going on the turnpike from Ithaca to Owego. Well, those wagons were large. They had tires on them 12 inches, 9 inches wide, some of them. And if they held an average of 4 tons, that would mean that you'd have to have, let's see, 25 wagons to equal the, yes, 25 wagons, I figured 100 tons. So if you had 8 horses on a wagon and there were 800 teams, which is arbitrary, of course, let's say that's 100 wagons. That's 4 times as much stuff being hauled in one day over over the dirt road than could be hauled on the railroad. I don't know if they ever figured that out, but it didn't make too much sense to me. But you know, those inclined planes were like a lot of inventions. Might not have been too good, but hey, we got it, and it does work, so we'll use it. Turned out they were very unsafe too. The passengers, they even lowered passengers, believe it or not, in passenger cars down the thing. And one time, one broke loose and some people were badly hurt. It was only by the grace of God that no one was killed. One guy rode it all the way to the bottom and he wasn't in very good shape. Anyways, this sort of set the tone for the railroad. Horses drawing the cars, an inefficient method of getting the cars up out of Ithaca onto the railroad, and then trot down through to Owego. They changed horses up here at Gridleyville, and generally they claim the trip took 3 hours. Somebody did, but that's probably from Ithaca to Gridley's would have been 3 hours, and then another 2.5 or so from there to Owego. And this is with the horses trotting about 7-8 miles an hour. And so it just wasn't a very good deal. And of course they had one track. It had the rails were straps of iron fastened onto wood planks. The cars tended to jump off. If the empties coming back north, which most of them were at that point when they first started, people riding in passenger cars would have to get off and pull their car off from the track and let the loaded cars coming down go through and so on. It just was not an efficient operation. Well, it went along a while. In the 1840 or so, they got a locomotive, a primitive locomotive that was built in Albany by a guy that claimed he knew something about mechanics and about steam engines and so on. And he came up with this design, which is a picture of it over there, old Puff. Yes, if you got enough steam up, you could make it move, and yes, it would pull some cars, but it was very inefficient. The steam bonnet was too big for the firebox, and so on and so forth. So they finally had to give that up and go back to horses. And then after a while, they remodeled it, strengthened it, made it put a different arrangement onto it so it was more efficient. But even so, it didn't work very well. They burned wood, of course, and they'd get going pretty good up toward Ithaca. They'd get going pretty good, and then by the time they got to Wilseyville, they'd run out of wood. So they ended up, one time they came down and they ran out of steam, and they finally had to haul the thing back to Ithaca with a workhorse. And so it went, and it just didn't work very good. And finally they got to the point where they just couldn't meet the interest payments on the money that the state had loaned them, and they went bankrupt. And this was 1842. Well, the state couldn't own the railroad, so they, there was a fellow that was the controller of the state of New York. His name was Archibald McIntyre, and he they sold it at an auction, and he bid it in for $13,500. That's all of the rolling stock they had, the cars, the horse cars, I suppose the horses, the whole 9 yards. Well, he was involved, or maybe was involved, I'm not sure, with a bunch of guys out of Pennsylvania. And you will probably recognize some of the names. I won't go into it in big detail, but one of them was George W. Scranton, who I believe was later the governor of Pennsylvania. But he and some Phelps, people by the name of Phelps and Dodge, William E. Dodge, they were all involved in the coal business. So they formed a new company called the Cayuga and Susquehanna Railroad Company, and they bought the property from Archibald McIntyre for $13,500. See, he was actually a state employee. He didn't buy it personally, but the state couldn't own it, so he acted for the state. So these people got the railroad for $13,500, what there was of it. And then they went to work to improve it, and they did. They finally got it. By the time 1847 came around, 1848, they had it in pretty good shape. They put in the T-rails. The old strap rails had been outlawed. One of the terrible things it did when you put the heavy locomotives on, these straps would curl up and come up loose from the boards or the planks, and sometimes it would cause damage to the cars. And so they got things pretty well set up for the T-rails. They built 5 miles of switchbacks to replace the inclined plane, and things were looking up. And in the meantime, about 1849 or so, the Erie Railroad reached Owego. Well, that meant that coal, anthracite coal, could come out of Pennsylvania and come up to Owego and be put on or the cars could be put on to at that point, Cayuga and Susquehanna Railroad, and taken to Ithaca, where they were offloaded onto barges and taken up the lake to the barge canal, and via that way, central New York industries, big market, big bucks for those times. And so everything looked pretty good. And then I should have mentioned that in 1847, they were, unfortunately, there was a bad accident with one of their locomotives that they had beefed up was too much for the bridge down at Woodbridges here near Catatown, and went through and killed the engineer and the fireman. But that was unfortunate. And so, but they went on from there, and as I say, they got it going pretty well, and the coal started flowing northward, which was a reversal of what it had been doing. All the salt and the plaster, pretty much, and other commodities, wheat, flour, pork, whiskey, various farm produce was going south to Owego, and then when that kind of dried up, the coal began to make it pay going the other way too. So, I mean, I shouldn't say it dried up. The coal made it so that the cars weren't going back empty a lot of the time. And so it became much more efficient and profitable. Well, then, 1855, the Cuyahoga-Susquehanna, which was made up of these fellows that I mentioned, and a bunch of others. They leased the Cuyahoga-Susquehanna to the DL&W, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. And so then that worked out pretty well. They had let's see, I don't have that here probably, but yeah, here it is. Let's see here. They assumed the mortgages that were against it. Let's see here. And whereas there are now 2 mortgages upon the said C&S, one for the sum of $300,000, which comes due January 1st, 1865, and the other for $100,000 due January 1st, 1864, which mortgages were given to secure bonds issued by C&S to the amount aforesaid, $400,000 that is. And whereas other bonds have been issued by C&S, which are not thus secured by mortgage to the amount of $100,000, which become due January 1st, 1862. Now therefore it is mutually agreed by the parties hereto that when the said bonds become due and payable, if the same shall not be discharged by the said party of the first part and said so on, in case of the purchase by them of the said bonds or any part thereof shall have the right to apply the same in discharge of the rents agreed to. And the rent was agreed to $70,000 a year for 45 years at that point. And I figured that out, if it ran the 45 years, which it did eventually, and some besides, much besides, that was $3,500,000 or something like that. A lot of money. Anyhow, so it's now a part of the DL&W, and became, as you all know, a very, very important part of the history of Candor. Not that it was any different than any other more town in that respect, but it's interesting to realize that practically every business every farm enterprise practically that wasn't sold locally, the produce that wasn't sold locally or utilized locally, everything that came into the town and went out of the town practically went on the railroad. It was literally the lifeblood of the town. And of course, as I say, that's typical of most other small towns across the country of the U.S. You could get anything practically here that you could manage to load on a flat car or into a car. Just endless a variety of stuff. Anything from women's corsets to fresh oysters. Oh, they were a big thing there for a while. Everybody had an oyster bar, and they were packed in ice and down in Jersey and sent up here, and people just loved them. I suppose they made oyster stew. I doubt if anybody ate them raw, but who knows? I should.
A lot of people do.
Anyways, every suit of clothes, every stone for the cemetery, anything you could think of in the way of merchandise, raw materials that came in on the train. In the after the Civil War, 1870s, early 1870s, the leather people that made leather began to set up tanneries in upstate, well away from the original places where they were. The reason was the hemlock trees had all been cut further away, so they had to set their tanneries up in the uplands where the trees were to get the bark to tan the leather. So the hides all had to come in on the train, and then after they were processed and dried, they were loaded back on the trains and taken back to the city areas where they were processed into whatever they made with them. Boots, shoes, harness, parts of wagons, you name it. Stagecoach. There were still a few stagecoaches around. Some of the wagons were suspended on leather springs even at that point. And so you can't possibly name a thing that didn't come in on the railroad and go out on it. And then, of course, there was the passenger service. People could get on a train and go practically anywhere in the country that was reachable by train, stagecoach, or even on foot if you had to walk a little ways. So you could go to California, you could go to New York City, you can go shopping, wherever. Later on, when people like Edward Wands originated the glove company, and later it was called the Cantor Glove Company. He was a great salesman, and he traveled extensively in the West selling his gloves. And he knew how to make good gloves, and he did make good gloves. And the Cantor Glove Company became well known for Wands Glove Company, and later the Cantor Glove Company, which carried on his tradition of making good gloves. And one of the reasons was that he, and there again, all his raw materials came in on the railroad, and his product went out on the railroad. And so he recognized that the workers, the railroad workers themselves, and the steel mill workers, and the miners in the West, they all had to have good quality gloves, rugged gloves. They didn't want to spend their money for something that was going to wear out in a day's time. So Cantor Glove Company got a pretty good reputation for making good gloves. In fact, when they, toward the end of their existence, they were exporting to Liverpool, England, some. And I suppose the steel mills over there bought them, or some of the other rugged industries. But that's just one facet of the use of the railroad. And there were other passengers too. The school kids came to Cantor High School from outlying districts. If they got to go to high school, after 8 grades in the country, one-room country school, they rode on the train. And it was very important for the college students, Cornell University, Ithaca College later on. Thousands of students rode through on the Cayuga and Susquehanna, one of the Ithaca branch, as it was with the DL&W then. And so it was of tremendous importance to the town, and that's not to say anything about the effects it had on agriculture. As dairy farm, or as sheep farming gave way to dairy farming, you had milk, live, whole milk was sent out, begun to be sent out to the cities to be sold as whole milk, whereas before it had been butter, something that would keep. And refrigerator cars were developed and so on, so that you could ship whole milk to the city. And creamery was built here in 1892 or such matter. And later on there was one in Wilsonville, and Borden's bought the one in Cantor and modernized it, and Dairymen's League was formed, and the farmers began to sell large amounts of milk. This dairy farming came into its own, largely because of the railroad, which was, of course, as I said before, typical of the region. Then there was other things, apples, potatoes, buckwheat. Buckwheat was sold locally, a lot of it. Most of it was sold locally. Made into flour, which was sent on the railroad various places. Cantor's buckwheat flour was peddled widely. And other produce, hay, extra hay. There was a great demand for hay in the cities to feed the horses, people's horses, and of course the police departments had horses. Everybody had horses, so they had to be fed, and you couldn't raise hay in the city, so they had to buy it from upland, upstate, and on and on and on. I'm sure this is all very enlightening because you already knew it. But anyways, the thing is, the railroad was very, very important to rural life, the culture of the area, economics of the area. For about 100 years, I would say, it was the institution that guided practically everything else that went on in the region, in the area, especially the southern tier here. Well, everything has to come to an end, right? One of the things that caused the demise of many railroads was the invention of the automobile, as you well know. And subsequently the development of trucks, large trucks, and coincidentally better highways that they could run on. So this, you might say, the invention of the automobile was sort of the beginning of the end of the railroad's heyday. And I suppose that's true, but on the other hand, there were other things that had their heyday, and the railroad was the beginning of their end. So I guess turnabout is fair play. Canals, for instance, lost out to the railroads. Another factor was that competition took some of the business away from the Ithaca and Owego, we'll call it, I&O. It still is the I&O, even though it has a different name. I want to, after a bit, I'll tell you a little story here, relay a little story that goes back to something I mentioned before. These early automobiles really didn't do much to threaten it for quite a long time. And then, of course, trucks and so on were not developed right away, very efficient trucks, and buses and those sorts of things. But gradually, things began to eat away at the railroad's profitability. The mails that were always carried on the railroad went by truck after a while. And then, well, just the produce that came from distribution centers and so on, the wholesalers that began to crop up here and there in the bigger cities, Binghamton and so on. The wholesalers sent their stuff by truck and no longer came much by railroad. So it was a gradual thing. The Depression kept things alive pretty much, but during the Depression the farms went out of business, a lot of them, and some became a little larger to keep going. World War II was still, the trains were still fairly useful, but strangely enough, in '42, in the middle of the war, so to speak, they stopped passenger service on the I&O, and just a kind of another chink in the armor. And so, but by then, buses were running some, and so after World War II, things began to really accelerate in the automotive world, and so the freight trains were, by 1950, 55, 54, somewhere along in there, they were down to very few. One of the main characters in this whole scenario was the farm feed manufacturers who catered to the farmers' needs and livestock needs. So that in this, the mill here in Candor was basically two mills originally, and they, as I mentioned, they made flour, but they also made a lot of cattle feed and so on. But then later on, the Ward Van Scoy built a new mill on Rich Street, or enlarged an older building that was there originally called the Hay Barn, and built a big complex of bins and so on, and finished it in 1948. And that was just about the time that things were declining in the railroad business, and they were losing money fairly rapidly at that point for various reasons, but mostly because of the lack of freight. They had lost their business with Morse Chain in Ithaca, and a number of the other industries in Ithaca had become used to using trucks and so on. So there was very little traffic came out of Ithaca on the railroad, and so it was becoming apparent that it was not going to be around very long. And they cut out the freight service after a bit, cut it down to 2 trains a week. And so it probably wasn't any big surprise that in 1955, the DL&W petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to discontinue the railroad, to abandon it from Ithaca to Owego, which is all it ever was. Other railroads had come and gone, I guess you might say, and branches were here and there, and the Elmira, EC&N, Elmira, and Cortland and Northern had branches that ran here and there. And I wanted to talk about some others here in a minute. But anyways, they applied, and I'll just read this. This is the death knell here. The legal death knell. It's the axe, the final axe, and it was dropped by Charles E. Clark, Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals, Second Circuit, Stephen W. Brennan, U.S. District Judge, and James T. Foley, U.S. District Judge, on May 21st, 1957. But here's a little history, briefly reviewed here. Application seeking a certificate authorizing the abandonment of the branch was filed in November 1955. Public hearings were thereafter held on March 29th and 30th, 1956. Exceptions thereto were later filed, and those exceptions were from the Village of Candor, Ward of Vanscoy, Candor Cooperative GLF, Philip M. King, President of Candor Business Bureau, Arthur Hollenbeck and Son, and that's it. Okay. The commission therefore thereafter filed its report and an order dated October 25th, 1956 was entered permitting the abandonment of the branch. Petitions for reconsideration and for a further hearing to consider alleged new evidence were thereafter made and denied by orders of January 28th, 1957 and March 5th, 1957. March 15th, 1957 was fixed as the effective date of the certificate permitting such abandonment. This action was started about March 12th, 1957. This action meaning, referring to this one I'll get to. A temporary restraining order was issued. A 3-judge statutory court was convened. By agreement, the consideration of the application for a temporary and final injunction came on to be heard before said court on April 23rd, 1957. The record made before the Interstate Commerce Commission is before the court. Additional affidavits were offered by plaintiffs in lieu of oral evidence. The essential facts as disclosed, let's see here. Yeah. The essential facts as disclosed may be briefly stated. There has been in existence since 1833 a railroad line extending a distance of 34.79 miles from the village of Owego to the city of Ithaca, New York. The line was operated under lease by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad Company from 1855 to 1946 when it was acquired by merger. It is generally referred to as the Ithaca branch, same connecting with the main line of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad at Owego. The branch follows generally an improved state highway. It has served primarily some 5 or 6 villages or hamlets, and the area traversed may be generally referred to as farming or residential area. Passenger service has been suspended over the branch since 1942. Now, this is the last ditch stand. The plaintiffs that had tried to get them to not abandon the road, basically what they were after was to keep the road open from Owego to Candor. Okay, this affidavit, or petition I should say, is in C.P. Ward's name, C. Paul Ward. Being duly sworn, C. Paul Ward being duly sworn deposes and says, this affidavit supplements my affidavit made such and such. I am advised that the above entitled action will be disposed of at the trial thereof to be held in Albany on April 23rd, 1957. Therefore, it is unnecessary to answer in detail many of the erroneous and misleading statements made by officers, employees, and counsel for the railroad in affidavits filed in opposition to the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction. The affidavits of Mr. Ralph S. Bird and Mr. Curtis F. Bayer made reference to per diem loss of the railroad. The loss estimated of $100 is not supported by any factual data. Keep in mind now, this is desperation. On the other hand, I know that in the business of Ward and Van Scoy Incorporated, and in the case of Arthur Hollenbeck and Son, it would take 8 trips of a 5-ton truck to unload a car of feed at Owego. At a minimum, that would involve an extra cost of from $3 to $4 a ton. It is misleading to say that that cost could be passed on to consumers. Consumers just won't pay that additional cost. Competition won't support it, and it would mean that we would just lose that business. On the basis of the tonnage involved, Ward and Van Scoy Incorporated and Arthur Hollenbeck and Son would have lost at least $11,000 for the first 3 months of 1957 if the branch line had been discontinued. That would mean that we as shippers would lose an estimated $127 a day against the unsupported estimate of the railroad of $100 a day. We do not know whether the $100 a day is based on depreciation in the cost of scrap iron or what it is based on. Although permitted to do so by the order of certificate of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and although not restrained by the order of Honorable Stephen S. W. Brennan for so doing, the Lackawanna Railroad has not taken up all of its tracks between Candor and Ithaca, although I am advised that it has taken up a few rails near Ithaca. I caused the prices of scrap rails random length to be transcribed from the records of a standard magazine known as Iron Age. Attached here too is a tabulation of the price of scrap rails at Buffalo, New York, the nearest point on the Lackawanna Railroad. Also attached here too are photostats of a few of the sample pages taken from copies of Iron Age, namely the issues of so-and-so and so-and-so, and a chart showing fluctuations in the price of scrap rails. It is difficult to reconcile the attached data with the statements made by Mr. Bayer on, quote, cast iron pipes, end quote. It would seem that the price of scrap rails is more accurately related to railroad rails. I did investigate and find that the Lackawanna Railroad has made substantial shipments of freight over the Owego-Candor spur from January 1st, 1957 as follows. And he lists the company. Of course, now he's got down here Warren Van Scoy, $9,000. Ralston Perina Company in Owego. Well, you see he's grasping. Candor Co-op, GLF, yeah, that was $564. And it didn't really amount to much. Stackmore Company Incorporated in Owego. There again, he's grasping. Tioga Foundry in Owego. Arthur Hollenbeck, the only other one that really would count for much was $4,887. And he gives the total, so on and so forth. The railroad has offered no proof as to what expenses should be charged against such gross revenue. In the answering affidavits of the railroad appear references to an all-weather highway which parallels the Ithaca branch, and references to the fact that there are at least 6 motor common carriers of freight having certificates from the Interstate Commerce Commission. That may be true in theory, but the practical answer is that the carriers which serve Candor and Catatunk are light truckers which carry special express jobs like paint and small building materials, hardware, and so forth, but no trucks which serve Candor or Catatunk are equipped to carry grain and other commodities in bulk. Grain generally runs 30 to 40 tons to a freight car, and the most that these truckers would carry would be about 5 tons at the maximum to a truck. The statement in the record and in the answering affidavits to the effect that the feed dealers in our area could get corn, oats, and wheat from Buffalo at 97 cents a ton is also misleading. First, because I have since found out from Cargill and Buffalo that when they quoted me the figures of 97 cents a ton, they didn't tell me that there was a loading charge of $1 a ton in addition to the increased rate of 97 cents. Secondly, we get very little corn, oats, and wheat from buffalo. In order for us to manufacture feed, we have to have constantly on order the following commodities: soybean meal, bran, hominy, gluten, linseed meal, brewer's grain, beet pulp, and linseed oil meal. The bulk of the commodities are shipped by rail from the Midwest. He didn't say molasses because I think that was coming by truck at that point. Okay, this is desperation. So, what happens? It is sufficient to say, this is the judges speaking, it is sufficient to say that the evidence disclosed that the branch as a whole has been a losing proposition from a financial standpoint for at least 5 years, that a considerable outlay of money is required for maintenance purposes to restore and to maintain the branch in a safe operating condition. Operations at the present time are restricted as to speed and the type of equipment which may be used on and over the branch. Well, that was true. If you ever stood on the tracks or near the tracks and watched one of those trains coming towards you, you'd wonder how it ever got anywhere. There is actually no dispute or objection to the abandonment of that part of the branch extending from the village of Candor to the city of Ithaca, and no serious objection was made there too. Objections were filed to the abandonment of the whole branch by Arthur Hollenbeck and Son, Warden of Vanscoy Incorporated, and Candor Cooperative GLF Service, all of whom are engaged in the manufacturing and sale of feed and the furnishing of farm equipment supplies at Candor and Catawba. They raised no objection, however, to the abandonment of the segment of the branch between Candor and Ithaca. Their evidence and argument is limited to the contention that the portion of the branch between Owego and Candor, a distance of 10 7/10 miles, should be deleted from the order permitting the abandonment. The contention is based on argument that the record is insufficient